this comes up a lot in my conversations. We were talking about joint ownership. And I think historically, a lot of people use joint ownership because they didn't think there was another way to make sure their family had access to money. And so I like to dig deep with families. And I say, okay, do you want your son or daughter as joint owners so they can potentially write checks and pay bills while you're alive? Or because you truly want them to be an owner of this account? Because, Craig, if someone just wants someone to write checks and help pay bills as they get older, I'm assuming they can do that through financial power of attorney or joint signer where you haven't given ownership away. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the best way to make sure there's no problems with the account. In fact, power of attorney, that's exactly why it was created, to give access when you're sick or immediate, but only while you're alive, and to make sure that if you can't do it yourself, bills are paid, right? But it says nothing to after when you pass away, though.
But that keeps the protection where your child isn't on there as a true owner.
Exactly, because with ownership brings liability. So if they get sued, if they get divorced, if they get a bankruptcy, if they get disabled, any of those issues, now that account is considered that person's, that child, that person you put on there to have access. And suddenly those monies are now threatened by the liabilities of that person you put onto the account.
Because I realize most people are like, well, I'm not worried about my son stealing my money. And so I kind of squashed. I'm like, no, if you thought your kid was going to steal your money, this wouldn't even be a conversation. It's the things that are out of their control. Like you said, they get an accident, their business goes sideways, they have credit issues. Right. Most people don't realize divorce, any good divorce attorney is going to go after that money. If it's not a pleasant divorce, which most of them are not.
You know, and I gotta stop you there for a second, Phil. I have to blame a lot of institutions that allow this to happen without telling the client what they're doing and the consequences.
I mean, a 23-year-old bank teller that says, "Oh, we'll just put Johnny on there as a joint owner. We'll solve all that."
I mean, it's just so sad that they sit there and they go around. You know, I always say it's a 25-cent McDonald's story. You know, these guys, the seniors are in at 6 o'clock in the morning at McDonald's getting their 25-cent cup of coffee, and they're all talking how to avoid things without paying for an attorney to get advice. And that 25-cent, advice ends up costing them millions of dollars because they said, well, just Johnny at the bank said put their name on it, or my advisor said just make the kids, a beneficiary, and make sure that nothing is going to change in their lives and everything will be okay. Well, that's not the real world we're living in anymore. It's a different world than 25, 30 years ago.
So if sometimes I try to separate some of these issues because a lot of times clients go, well, I'm not worried about that, and I'm not one to argue with people. I like to educate. So if they're like, well, I'm not worried about my kid's credit, bankruptcy, lawsuits, there are other issues with having someone on as joint owner.
Right.
A lot of times I've seen a lot of wills say, well, I want my 2 children, we'll make it easy math, to have 50-50 of my estate.
Right.
So let's say they have $500,000 in their estate. 50,000 of that's in a savings account that one of the kids is on as joint owner.
Sure.
What people don't realize, and correct me if I'm wrong, when they pass away, that 50,000 that's in the joint savings account only goes to the joint owner. And now they split the 450,000 that's left over 50-50. So now one of the beneficiaries just got more money than what they intended to happen.
Right. It's crazy.
Is that a realistic scenario?
It is. And also part of the estate plan, the person's trying to make things as fair and as even as possible. And suddenly this variable is now thrown that off because we don't know what the final expenses will be. We don't know what's going to happen. Is that person going to keep that money? Are they going to disperse it evenly according to the estate plan when they have no obligation to do so? And it really just brings in another issue at a time when we don't want these issues to come about or be discussed, for that matter.
Well, and that's the whole purpose of estate planning is I always look at it as if you're doing even basic estate planning, will, maybe a trust, you're doing that because you care about your beneficiaries. You're doing it because you want to make it easy for them on one of the most difficult days of their life, the day you pass away.
Right.
And that's where the beneficiary liquidity plan comes into play, is that we saw a lot of families do joint ownership because they didn't know of any other option, right? And I always use the analogy, for generations, families have just figured it out when a loved one passed away. But my definition of figuring it out means there's arguments, there's disagreements, there's possible short-term, long-term financial hardship. And if you care about your beneficiaries and you are leaving them any sort of inheritance, with the beneficiary liquidity plan, we eliminate those risks. We protect the money. We make sure it's available without a death certificate within 48 hours of your passing, using the money you've already earmarked. It's simply a matter of figuring out what's the minimum your family needs, and we move it left pocket to right pocket. And what I love about this is we can actually do it over the phone because it's already your money. And so for us, is educating people, working with great wealth managers like you, Nick, and estate planning attorneys like you, Craig, to educate people that there's a better way, an easier way, a safer way to accomplish what they really want to happen. And that's where the beneficiary liquidity plan fits in.
The short-term need to not worry about who's going to pay what. And that's really what it comes down to.
And you don't have to buy anything to do it. That's what I really think people struggle most with, realizing that they're not buying anything. It's just repositioning assets to make sure they're set up properly and available.
Exactly.